just revisit the safety of polymer clay as it is today, because it's changed some over the years. And you had a nice riff on toxicity versus irritation. And I like that. And how I know you said that we do ourselves a disservice when we alarm people about this.
Yes, I absolutely agree about that. And I think of, and this may not be the Oxford English Dictionary definition of toxicity versus irritant, but I think of toxicities as causing, if not permanent, more substantial harm. And I think of an irritant as something like, onion juice in your eyes, that type of thing, something that's very temporary. So I think that we cannot really say at this point that polymer clay is toxic, not by any definitions that we know of. It's possible further down the road that we would find that plasticizers are causing long-term damage to human beings in general. The problem is that all 7 billion people of us on the planet live with plastics. Almost all plastics have plasticizers of one sort or another in them, and this is in order to help them to melt and to be malleable and to be usable, to be soft enough. And in the case of polyvinyl chloride, the plasticizers are important in maintaining a supple and soft plastic. And they are important in helping melt in fusion in our particular clay-like substance. So, and there are many types of plasticizers, and there have been many generations of plasticizers, but we should not delude ourselves by saying that because the phthalates have been taken out of the current generation of polymer clays, that we don't have plasticizers in the polymer clays. Maybe you wouldn't call them plasticizers, maybe the industry would not like to call them plasticizers, but there's some kind of chemical equivalent in that clay, or you could not get that vinyl chloride to fuse and melt. So whether we have data on that generation of whatever equivalent they're using or not is a question. We may not have data on that. So therefore it's quote unquote safe and it passes the standards. Probably the phthalates were safe also in the way that we use the clay. There are several different routes by which you can get substances into your body. You can eat them. You can absorb them through your skin. You can absorb them in your lungs. And there are a few other routes that are
Yes.
possible for getting things into your body. But, if we look at polymer clays and we look at how we use them, we are not eating it by and large. And there have been rat studies where they've been fed phthalates, or they've been fed clay, I believe. And there have been no ill effects in those studies. Now, these were done 20 years ago. So I'm not up on the most current research. The skin absorption is possible in very small quantities, but generally speaking, our skin is an excellent barrier. So very little plasticizer is going into our skin. Probably when we work around our house and we work with cleaning chemicals and things like that, we're absorbing far more noxious substances through our hands. When we work with polymer clay, those people who are really concerned about plasticizers or think that they are being affected by them wear what? Plastic gloves, vinyl gloves with plasticizers in them. So that's hardly the route you want to go if you're going to try to avoid absorption of plasticizers. And then the last route is lungs. Lungs are a problem for all kinds of substances, not just polymer clays. The instances that comes to mind for me when we work with polymer clays are the use of buffing wheels. Now, when we sand polymer clay, it's not going to be enough. We can use the water to sort of trap any chaff that we get off of it, but generally speaking, that's not the problem. The problem is with the buffing wheels, where you get very, very fine particulate coming off those buffing wheels. So if people were concerned about absorption through lung, then wear a dust mask. And I don't know anybody who consistently wears dust masks. So those are our main absorption routes, and I think we're pretty much covered on all of them except the absorption through the lungs, and you have a very clear way that you can protect yourself from that. Now, let's go to the amount of absorption of plasticizers. When you go into the hospital and you have an IV bag hung, your level of phthalate goes sky high because there are tons of plasticizers in the tubing and the bags that go into that. Those have been used for nearly 50 years by hospitals and institutions. Almost all of us have had exposure to that. And if there were real toxic health hazards relating to phthalates, then we would all show evidence of sickness from that, and they would have stopped using them. But those aren't rated as unhealthy. So I'm not quite sure why we're all in a twit over polymer clays. I mean, you get vast quantities of exposure. Now, we work with polymer clay on a more routine basis, and, we're working with it weekly or sometimes daily. Maybe we're getting a little bit of absorption, but nothing like you would get in a hospital setting. But let's face it, we live with plastics. We're not going to stop living with plastics. They are an essential part of the 20th and 21st century, and they're really relatively new when you think about it. So, kind of deal with it.
About the safety of baked polymer, putting a whistle to your lips, is that a problem? Why can't I make a plate that I can eat off of?
There are residual plasticizers left in polymer clays after baking. Here's the deal. The plasticizer is important in order to allow the plastic to melt, to undergo a melt or a fusion. So if we bake polymer clay at a relatively high temperature all at once and fully fuse it, then we're getting a stronger product than if we bake it many, many times, just a little bit. Now that I know that it's a problem because I do very high tolerance loop and loop chaining and braiding with the clay. And if it isn't really, really well fused, it will break. And it requires that high temperature and that one-time baking. I can't just little by little bake the clay, and hope at a lower temperature for short times and hope for it not to break. So if you're going to blow a whistle, how long are you going to have lip contact? Not very long, generally speaking. If you're, carry it around in your mouth all day and slobber on it, I don't know, that might be a problem. So I wouldn't worry about that. I think the same reason we don't like to use plastic so much anymore to store pasta sauce in the refrigerator, if you can help it, and store it in glass, there's probably some leaching, and I think probably real acidic foods that are in constant contact. I personally wouldn't mind eating potato salad off of a polymer plate. It wouldn't bother me. I don't think it's on there long enough to absorb much of anything and to be any kind of a problem. And I'm certainly not going to get any kind of plasticizer levels that would be equivalent to the many IV bags I have endured over my life.
And would you use a spoon that you've used or a knife that you've used in polymer you would wash thoroughly and use again with food?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Right.
The only two things that I wouldn't use a toaster oven that I had used for polymer because I just couldn't get, and we all know that there's that oily substance
Yeah.
that leaches out. Well, I'm guessing that that's plasticizer. I haven't read anything about that. It's been a number of years, but I'm guessing that's plasticizer that's coming off. And it's real oily, sticky stuff, and it's just nasty. It wipes right off with alcohol.
Right.
And I think it's probably, you could probably clean up a toaster oven pretty well if you had to with alcohol, but getting in all the spaces and stuff. But that's a lot of material
Yeah.
that comes off those ovens. And I regularly wipe mine down with alcohol, but so I wouldn't do that. And the pasta machine wouldn't inherently bother me, except that it's that having used it for pasta, I really wouldn't want all that.
Egg.
Yeah, I wouldn't want all that stuff in my polymer. And I'm just not sure how clean you can really get a pasta machine, unless you were to take the rollers out, dunk it upside down in alcohol and swish it around a
Right.
whole lot. You could probably get away with it on that level too.
Right.
But I would caution people just as good manners to not resell your polymer pasta machine in thrift shops.
Oh, sure.
As honestly, I don't think they're harmful. I mean, that's my take on it. I think there are very sensitive people that have a lot of problems with their immune systems and may be much more sensitive to all types of synthetic compounds that we live with in our environment. And, perhaps art is just
It's
not
not
your
for them. Yeah, you're right. You're
just,
right.
just write poetry.
And you were talking about skin as one of the ways that we can be affected by chemicals. And you don't use gloves.
I don't use gloves because gloves have plasticizer in them. I use a barrier cream, and the one that I love the best is called Soft Guard, and you can get that on the internet. And we used to use it a lot in the laboratory because we were going in and out of vinyl gloves all day, and they were powdered, and it was the powder that bothered our hands, and so we used the barrier cream to avoid the powder equivalents. But I have always found when I read in the literature years ago in the chemistry literature, 300 degrees was when fusion or melt occurred. And so I think that I try to get up as close as I can to that because while the plasticizer is still around, before it's had a chance to sort of, evaporate, it's there to really help that fusion to happen right away. The analogy that I used to use when teaching is that if you take wax and it's in a bunch of little balls, little pellets, and you sit it in a saucepan on the stove, don't recommend doing this, but if you do that and you partially melt it, but you don't completely melt it, you've got all the little fenestrations and air pockets. You can take that piece of wax out when cooled and break it apart into pellets again fairly easily. But if you really melt the wax all the way so that it's one cohesive liquid, it's very, very strong. So I sort of use that as a visual to get you to understand why it's important to do a really good fusion or melt. And the plasticizer is the help or the aid, the assist that does that. So I want to put out a little bit of a disclaimer there that my information and my take on this is somewhat dated.
Right.
And I haven't looked up the latest of
and the manufacturers aren't very forthcoming with that kind of information either.
No, they're not. And they're worried about liability. And
Oh, this is great. This is great. I think we did it.
Okay, good. Cynthia, I hope that was